The stagecoach was burning. Clara Whitfield stood 20 feet from everything she owned in this world and watched it turn to ash under a Montana sky so vast it seemed designed to remind her how small she was. The flames climbed high enough to make the September air shimmer. She could feel the heat on her face singeing the fine hairs on her arms, baking the tears dry before they could fall. Inside that fire was a suitcase containing two dresses, a sewing kit, and $47 she had saved over 2 years by taking extra mending work after hours and hiding the coins inside a flower jar where her aunt would never look. Inside that fire was the cameo brooch her mother had worn every Sunday to church on Beacon Hill. Inside that fire, curling and blackening and crumbling into nothing, was the only photograph of her parents. Edwin and Rose Whitfield, taken on their wedding day in 1848. Two faces trying to look solemn for the camera, but if you look closely, their eyes were smiling. Clara had studied that photograph every night for 5 years, trying to remember the exact sound of her father's voice, the lavender scent of her mother's Sunday dress, the feeling of being loved by people who chose you simply because you existed. Now it was gone. All of it. Every last thing. She stood on a dirt road in the middle of Montana territory with a torn dress, a bruise spreading purple across her cheekbone, and absolutely nothing else to her name. She had come 2,000 miles to start a new life, and in the space of 10 minutes, she had less than nothing. Before we go on, if you are new here, hit that subscribe button. I share new frontier stories every week. And drop a comment below. Where are you listening from tonight? I would love to know. Now let me tell you how Clara Whitfield ended up standing beside a burning stagecoach in the middle of nowhere, and how three strangers on horseback would change her life in ways she could never have imagined. 3 weeks earlier, Clara had been standing in a different kind of prison. A small room above her Aunt Ruth's tailor shop on Essex Street in Boston, staring at a white wedding dress laid out on a narrow bed. The dress was not one Clara had chosen. It was not one she wanted. It had been ordered by Aunt Ruth 3 months prior, the day Aldous Pemberton first walked into the shop and looked at Clara the way a man looks at livestock he intends to purchase. Pemberton was 55 years old, a merchant with damp hands and small eyes, and a reputation that traveled ahead of him like the smell of spoiled meat. His first wife had died of a fall down the stairs. His second wife had died of pneumonia. Both had died with bruises that nobody asked questions about because Pemberton was rich, and rich men in Boston could bury their sins under enough mahogany and marble to make them invisible. Aunt Ruth did not care about the bruises. Aunt Ruth cared about the monthly stipend Pemberton had promised. "You should be grateful," she said every evening, her voice sharp as her scissors. "He is offering you security. What else do you have? A dead mother's face and a dead father's arms." But Clara had something Aunt Ruth did not know about. A scrap of newsprint cut from the Matrimonial Times, folded so small it fit inside the hem of her working dress. 3 words that had become a kind of prayer: E. Dawson. Copper Creek, Montana Territory. She had written a letter. 3 drafts before the final version, each word weighed and measured. She had received a response on rough paper in neat handwriting. "Miss Whitfield, your letter was received with great pleasure. A stagecoach ticket to Copper Creek has been arranged at the Denver Depot under your name. I look forward to meeting you with sincerity. E. Dawson." The night before her wedding to Pemberton, Clara packed a small suitcase. She tucked one more thing into the lining almost as an afterthought. A letter her father had written on his deathbed, the handwriting shaking so badly she had to guess at half the words. It mentioned a debt, a name, Blackwood. She did not know why she brought it. Perhaps because it was the last thing her father's hand had touched. She climbed out the window at 3 in the morning, dropped onto the wet alley cobblestones, and walked to the train station without looking back. Not because she was brave, because she knew that if she looked back, she would see the narrow bed, the safe routine, the predictable misery that her aunt had arranged for her. And she would go back to it. Because sometimes fear is stronger than hope. So she did not look back. She kept walking. It had started at dawn. The stagecoach, a Concord model with leather thorough braces that creaked with every rut in the road, had left the last relay station before Copper Creek, just as the sun cracked the eastern horizon. Inside the coach sat Clara, her hands folded in her lap, her heart beating so hard she could feel it in her teeth. Across from her sat the Garrett family. William Garrett, a lean man with sunburned hands, and a Spencer repeating rifle prop between his knees. His wife Mary, who had spent most of the journey knitting a small yellow blanket and humming hymns under her breath, and their son Peter, 8 years old, with a gap in his front teeth and a fascination with everything that moved outside the window. Two other passengers rode on top with the driver, a merchant named Henderson, who carried a leather satchel he never let out of his sight, and Walt, the old driver himself, who had been running this route for 12 years and knew every creek crossing, every ridge, every place where the road narrowed enough to make a man nervous. It was that last kind of place where the bandits were waiting. They came out of a dry wash on the south side of the road. 6 riders with bandanas pulled up over their faces and guns already drawn. The leader was a big man on a black horse, wide across the shoulders, sitting the saddle like a man who had spent more of his life on horseback than off it. He did not announce himself. He did not give warning. He simply raised a Colt revolver and fired a shot into the air, and the horses pulling, the stagecoach screamed and tried to bolt. Walt hauled back on the reins with everything he had, and the stagecoach lurched sideways one wheel, dropping into a rut, the whole frame tilting at an angle that sent Clara sliding across the bench into William Garrett's knees. Then everything happened at once. William kicked open the coach door and brought the Spencer up to his shoulder, because William Garrett was the kind of man who did not hand over what was his without a fight. He got off one shot. It went wide. The bandit on the black horse shot back, and this time the bullet found its mark. William Garrett folded forward like a man kneeling to pray and fell face first into the dust. He did not move again. Mary screamed. Peter screamed. Clara did not scream because her throat had closed shut and her body had gone rigid, every muscle locked, every nerve on fire. Up on the driver's box, Walt took a bullet through the left shoulder and slumped sideways. Henderson was dragged down and beaten unconscious with the butt of a rifle. The stagecoach horses freed when one of the bandits cut the traces, bolted north across the prairie, and vanished. The robbery took less than 10 minutes. The bandits were efficient, methodical, and thorough. They took the luggage. They took the money. They took Mary Garrett's wedding ring, pulling it from her finger, while she knelt over her husband's body and wept. They took Henderson's precious satchel. They took Walt's boots. And when they came to Clara, one of them saw the cameo brooch at her throat and reached for it. Clara's hand shot up and grabbed his wrist. It was instinct, not courage. The brooch had been her mother's. The last thing Rose Whitfield had touched before the fever took her. Clara's fingers clenched around the bandit's wrist and held on. He hit her, a backhand across the face that snapped her head sideways and sent white light exploding behind her eyes. She let go. He ripped the brooch from her collar and dropped it into his saddlebag. Then he saw the photograph she was clutching to her chest. "What's that?" "Please, Fee." Her voice was a whisper. "It's just a picture. It's not worth anything to you." He took it anyway, looked at it. 2 faces in sepia, a man and a woman on their wedding day, serious and hopeful and long dead. The bandit snorted and tossed the photograph into the burning stagecoach. "Ain't worth nothing anyway." Clara watched her parents' faces curl in the heat, darken, and disappear. The bandits rode west. The dust settled behind them. And Clara Whitfield stood in the middle of Montana territory with nothing left in this world, except the clothes on her back, a bruise turning dark on her face, and a heart full of grief so heavy it made her knees buckle. She almost fell. Almost, but she did not, because Clara Whitfield had buried both her parents by the time she was 17, had survived 4 years under the roof of an aunt who treated her like an unpaid servant, had escaped a forced marriage to a 55-year-old man with wet hands and a dead wife nobody talked about, and had traveled 2,000 miles alone on a train and a stagecoach to a place she had never seen to marry a man she had never met. She had done all of this not because she was brave, but because the alternative was worse, and she had learned somewhere along the way that falling apart was a luxury she could not afford. So she did not fall. She straightened her spine, she wiped the blood from the corner of her mouth, and she went to work. She tore a strip from the hem of her skirt and knelt beside Walt, pressing the cloth against his shoulder wound, applying pressure the way she had seen a doctor do once when a man collapsed outside her aunt's shop on Essex Street. Walt groaned and tried to push her away. She held firm. "Be still, you are making it worse." She checked Henderson, unconscious, a gash on his temple but breathing. She rolled him onto his side so he would not choke if he vomited. She went to Mary Garrett. Mary was on her knees in the dirt, rocking back and forth, making a sound that was not crying and not screaming, but something in between, something animal and raw, that made Clara's blood run cold. William's body lay beside her. Peter stood 3 feet away, staring at his father's blood on his own small hands, his mouth open, his eyes empty. Clara knelt beside Peter first. She took his hands in hers and held them. "Look at me, Peter. Look at my eyes." He did slowly. "We are going to be all right. Do you hear me? I need you to sit down right here and watch over your mother. Can you do that for me?" The boy nodded. It was not much, but it was something. Clara placed him beside Mary and returned to Walt, adjusting the bandage, checking the bleeding. Then she stood up and looked around. Prairie. In every direction as far as the eye could see. Brown grass bending in a wind that smelled like sagebrush and dust, and nothing human. The Bitterroot Range sat blue and distant along the western horizon. The sky above was enormous and empty and offered no mercy whatsoever. She had no water, no food, no horse, no weapon, no map. She had no idea where the next town was or how far they were from the ranch where her supposed future husband was waiting. The September sun was climbing higher, and it was already hot enough to cook eggs on a flat stone. If they stayed here without shade or water, they would start dying before nightfall. Not from the wounds, from the land itself. That was when she heard the horses. Not one horse, 3. Her stomach dropped like a stone thrown down a well. They were coming back. The bandits were coming back to finish what they had started, and there was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, nothing between her and them except 50 yards of open prairie. Clara stepped in front of Mary and Peter. She planted her feet. She squared her shoulders. She had nothing in her hands, no weapon, no tool, not even a rock. But she stood there anyway because Clara Whitfield had learned long ago that the last thing you give up is the ground you are standing on. 3 riders came over the rise to the east. They were not the bandits. The first thing Clara registered was the size of them. All 3 were big men on big horses, but the one in front was something else entirely. He sat a massive bay horse the way a mountain sits on the earth, as if he had always been there and always would be. He was broad through the shoulders, thick through the arms, with a torso that strained the seams of his dark work shirt. His hat was pushed back, showing a face that looked like it had been carved with a dull knife and left unfinished on purpose. Dark hair fell past his collar, threaded with silver at the temples, despite the fact that he could not have been much past 30. His jaw was shadowed with 2 days of stubble, and his eyes, even from a distance, were the color of steel fresh from the forge. Elijah Dawson. Though Clara did not know his name yet, she only knew that looking at him was like looking at the mountains behind him. Both made her feel small. Both made her feel, for reasons she could not explain, that something solid still existed in the world. The rider to his left was younger, leaner, with chestnut hair that caught the sun in streaks of copper and gold. He moved on his horse with a restless energy, coiled and volatile, a Winchester rifle resting across the saddle in front of him. His eyes were the color of whiskey held up to firelight, and they burned with an intensity that bordered on anger. Even from 50 yards, Clara could feel the heat coming off him like a stove with the damper wide open. Boone Dawson, the wild one. The third rider was the youngest, sitting his horse with quiet steadiness, pale green eyes sweeping the wreckage, with the careful attention of someone who noticed everything. His hair was dark blonde, neatly kept compared to his brother's, and his hands were already reaching for a canvas bag tied behind his saddle. A medical bag, Clara would learn later. Levi Dawson always carried one. The 3 brothers had been riding to Copper Creek for fence wire and salt when they saw the column of black smoke rising from the prairie. Eli changed course without a word. He did not discuss it. He did not ask his brother's opinion. He simply turned his horse north, and the other 2 followed because that was how things worked with the Dawson brothers. Eli decided. The others followed. Not because they were afraid of him, but because he was almost always right. They reached the wreckage and pulled up short. Eli swung down from his saddle in a single fluid motion. On the ground, he was even more imposing. 6 feet 5 inches of work-hardened muscle and bone. His arms were thick as fence posts, corded with veins and marked with scars that told a story Clara could not yet read. His hands were enormous, calloused across every knuckle. The kind of hands that had split wood and dug wells and built walls, and Clara suspected done things in wartime that he would rather forget. He walked past her without a word and crouched beside Walt. His movements were calm, efficient, exact. He checked the wound, checked the pulse, adjusted the bandage Clara had made. Then he looked up and met her eyes for the first time. How long ago? His voice was deep and rough, like gravel settling at the bottom of a mountain creek. Clara felt it in her chest more than her ears. An hour, maybe less. They rode west. He nodded once. Then he was on his feet and moving to the next patient, checking Henderson, checking William Garrett's body, confirming what Clara already knew. Boone was already working his anger channeled into action. He pulled a hatchet from his saddlebag and began chopping branches from a stunted cottonwood near the road, stripping them, lashing them together with raw hide cord to build a travois for the wounded. His hands moved fast and sure. He chose wood by weight and grain, without thinking about it, tested each joint with a sharp tug before moving to the next. A man who knew tools the way a preacher knows scripture. Levi was beside Peter, crouched to the boy's eye level, speaking so softly Clara could not make out the words. But Peter nodded, and something in his frozen expression loosened just a fraction. Levi placed a gentle hand on the boy's shoulder and guided him to sit beside his mother. 3 men, 3 different kinds of strength, and not one of them wasted a single motion. Clara watched them work and felt something crack open in her chest. Not hope, not yet. Something smaller than that, something more fragile. The possibility that she might survive this day. Eli walked back to her. He did not look at the bruise on her face. He looked at her eyes. Our ranch is half a day north, shelter, water, food. I can send word to town for a doctor. Mary Garrett looked up from her husband's body, her voice ragged and raw. Why would you help strangers? It was Boone who answered, his voice sharp with the particular impatience of a man who considered the question an insult. Because our father would come back from the grave and beat us senseless if we rode past people who needed help. That reason enough for you. Levi Gentler, you are safe with us. I give you my word. Eli said nothing. He did not promise safety. He did not make speeches. He simply stood there, 6.5 feet of quiet certainty, and waited for a decision. Clara looked at each of them in turn. The stern one, the fierce one, the gentle one. 3 strangers offering shelter in a land that had just tried to kill her. I think we should go with them, she said, and was surprised by the steadiness in her own voice. We do not have another choice. Boone built the travois in under 20 minutes. He loaded Walt onto it, carefully checking the lashings twice, adjusting the angle so the wounded man's shoulder would not take the jolts. He hitched the travois to his own horse, gave the knots one final test, and nodded once. Good enough. Eli gave his horse to Mary Garrett without being asked. He simply dismounted, handed her the reins, and started walking. No explanation, no ceremony. Clara noticed that his stirrups were set for a man with very long legs, and Mary's feet did not come close to reaching them. But the horse was steady, and that was what mattered. Levi lifted Peter onto his own saddle, settling the boy in front of him with practiced ease. Have you ever ridden a horse, Peter? The boy shook his head. Well, this is Jasper. He is the most patient animal in Montana Territory. He once let a raccoon sleep on his back for 3 hours without moving. True story. Peter almost smiled. Almost. Eli handed Clara his canteen. He did not say drink. He did not say you need this. He simply held it out, and when she took it, his rough fingers brushed hers for a fraction of a second, and then he was walking again, eyes forward, scanning the horizon the way a man does when scanning for threats is as natural as breathing. The water was cool and clean and tasted like the best thing Clara had ever put in her mouth. They walked north. The sun climbed. The prairie grass whispered against their legs, and the mountains grew closer with every mile, shifting from blue shadows to green slopes stippled with pine. Clara walked near the front of the small procession, close to where Eli led the way. She found herself studying him when she thought he was not looking. He moved like something between a man and a force of nature. Fluid, watchful, silent. Every few minutes, his eyes would sweep the horizon in a slow arc east to west, then check behind them, then forward again. It was not nervousness, it was habit. The habit of a man who had learned in war that the threat you do not see is the one that kills you. His arms bare to the elbow where he had rolled his sleeves to work on the travois were roped with muscle and striped with scars. An old bullet graze on the left shoulder faded to white, a knife scar running diagonally across his right side disappearing under the hem of his shirt, smaller marks on his hands and knuckles. The history of a life lived hard and survived. Boone walked beside the travel wall, checking Walt every quarter mile, adjusting the lashings when the ground got rough. For all his hot temper, Boone Dawson had hands that knew their way around knots and timber and wounded men. He retied a slipped binding without breaking stride, testing the tension with a short tug and a grunt of satisfaction. Clara noticed that he carried his rifle in the crook of his left arm finger near, but not on the trigger, the barrel pointed at the ground. Ready but not reckless, a man who understood that a weapon was a tool, not a toy. Levi rode with Peter on his horse, the boy sitting in front wrapped in a wool blanket despite the heat, because shock does strange things to a child's body. Levi had one arm around the boy and the other on the reins, and he was telling a story in a low, steady voice about a bear who had wandered onto the ranch last spring and eaten every single one of their apples before falling asleep in the orchard. Peter had not spoken a word since the attack, but by the end of the story his shoulders had loosened and his head had stopped shaking. Clara noticed something else during the walk, something the brothers did not seem to realize they were doing. Every half hour or so, one of them would drift closer to her, not to talk, not to check on her, just to be near. Boone would adjust the travois until he was walking in within 10 feet of her. Levi would guide his horse closer until Peter could have reached out and touched her shoulder. Eli would slow his pace almost imperceptibly until she was walking beside him rather than behind. They were circling her, the way a herd circles its young when wolves are near. They were doing it by instinct, and Clara suspected they would have denied it fiercely if she had pointed it out. He looked like he had been carved from the mountains themselves, all rough edges and raw strength, and she thought irrationally that a man built like that could hold up a sky. The landscape changed as the hours passed. The flat brown prairie gave way to rolling hills covered in bunch grass. Ponderosa pines began to appear first in scattered clusters, then in thickening stands that cast long shadows in the late afternoon light. The air changed too, cooler, cleaner, sharp with the scent of evergreen and running water. When the sun began its descent toward the western peaks, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose and deepening gold, they crested a ridge and Clara saw Dawson Ranch for the first time. It sat in a small valley between two pine-covered slopes. The main cabin was built from thick logs chinked with mud, solid as a fortress. A wide porch wrapped around the front, and the door was made of heavy timber with iron hinges that looked like they could stop a charging bull. A clear stream ran alongside the property, singing over smooth stones, cold enough to numb the fingers even in September. There was a barn, weathered but well-maintained, a smokehouse with a peaked roof, a root cellar dug into the hillside, a corral where 4 horses stood watching the new arrivals with the calm curiosity of animals that had never been mistreated. It was not grand, it was not elegant, it was not anything that Clara, raised in the brick and cobblestone world of Boston, had ever imagined living in. But there was something about it that stopped her breath. The way the logs fit together tight and true, each one notched and seated with a carpenter's precision. The way the porch planks were worn smooth in the places where a man's boots had walked 10,000 times. The way the chimney rose straight and solid from the roof, built from creek stones fitted together without mortar, held by gravity and the stubbornness of the man who had stacked them. This was not a house that had been built for show. It was a house that had been built to last, to hold, to shelter the people inside it against everything the Montana sky could throw at them. And it had been built, Clara understood, without being told, by the very hands that had just pulled her from the wreckage of her old life. After the burning stagecoach and the endless prairie and the fear that had lived in her chest like a fist for the last 8 hours, it looked like the safest place on earth. Home, Eli said quietly, just the one word. And in that word Clara heard everything. Pride, exhaustion, love for a place he had built with his own 2 hands, out of nothing but timber and determination, and the stubborn refusal to be defeated by a world that had given him every reason to quit. But Clara did not know it yet. She did not know that the advertisement she had answered, the 3 careful words, E. Dawson, that had brought her 2,000 miles from Boston to this valley, held a secret. And when that secret came out, it would tear this family apart before it could bring them together. Getting everyone settled took the rest of the evening. Eli gave up his bed for Walt, who was feverish now, the shoulder wound seeping through the bandage. Boone hauled extra straw from the barn and made pallets on the floor for Mary and Peter. Levi cleaned and rebandaged Walt's wound with hands that were surprisingly steady and gentle for a man his size. Clara found her way to the kitchen because she needed something to do with her hands and her mind and her grief. If she stopped moving, the images would come. The photograph curling in the flames, William Garrett falling forward. The backhand that had snapped her head sideways and left this throbbing bruise on her cheek. If she stopped moving, she would shatter, and she could not afford to shatter. Not here, not now, not in front of these three men she did not know. So she cooked. The Dawson pantry was better stocked than she expected. Dried venison hung from hooks on a ceiling beam. Flour in a heavy oak barrel. Beans in canvas sacks. Cornmeal. Salt. Lard. Jars of preserved vegetables lined a shelf with military precision, each one labeled in neat handwriting. Wild honey in a clay pot. Coffee beans in a tin with a hinged lid. She made a thick stew from the venison beans. Wild onions she found hanging in a braid near the window, and a handful of dried herbs she could not identify, but that smelled like thyme and something sharper. She kneaded cornmeal with lard and salt and water and fried the cakes in a heavy cast-iron skillet on the wood stove, flipping them when the edges turned golden. She made coffee strong enough to strip paint because she had noticed the battered coffee pot and the dark ring inside it that suggested whoever lived here preferred their coffee with the approximate consistency of river mud. When the stew was ready, she ladled it into bowls and carried them to the table. Boone ate a spoonful and stopped. He looked at the spoon. He looked at the bowl. He looked at Clara. When was the last time food tasted like this? Levi took a bite and closed his eyes. Never. The answer is never. Eli ate 2 bowls. He did not speak. He did not compliment the food. He did not look at her. But he ate 2 bowls, and when he was finished, he set the spoon down with a care that suggested he was placing something precious rather than a utensil. And Clara knew with the instinct of a woman who had spent her life reading the silences between words that this was the highest praise Elijah Dawson was capable of giving. After the meal, with Mary and Peter asleep on their pallet and Walt resting fitfully in the back room, the cabin settled into an uneasy quiet. Boone sat by the fire cleaning his rifle with an oiled rag, his movements sharp and precise. Eli stood on the porch, a dark silhouette against the star-filled Montana sky. Clara washed the dishes in a basin of creek water she had heated on the stove, and Levi sat down on the porch steps beside her. He was quiet for a long time, long enough that Clara thought he might simply be keeping her company, which would have been enough. She was tired in a way that went deeper than muscle and bone. She was tired in her soul. Then he spoke. Miss Whitfield, Clara, I need to tell you something. She looked at him. His pale green eyes were full of something she recognized. Guilt. The particular shade of guilt that comes from doing something you believed was right and knowing it might destroy you anyway. The advertisement, he said. The one in the newspaper. E. Dawson, Copper Creek, Montana Territory. He swallowed. I wrote it. Clara felt the ground shift beneath her feet, not physically, something deeper than that, something in the architecture of the future she had been building in her mind for the past 3 months. You are E. Dawson. No, E stands for Elijah, my oldest brother. I used his name. The silence stretched. Does he know? No, ma'am, he does not know, and he is going to be very unhappy when he finds out. Clara sat with this information the way you sit with a doctor's diagnosis, carefully, feeling each part of it, trying to understand what it meant for the life she had planned. She had traveled 2,000 miles. She had left behind everything and everyone she knew. She had risked her life on a stagecoach through Bandit country. She had done all of this to meet a man named E. Dawson, who had written her a polite letter promising a home and a partnership and a chance at a decent life. And that man, the man she had been imagining for 3 months, did not exist, had never existed, was a fiction created by a 24-year-old younger brother with green eyes full of remorse. Why, she asked. Levi looked down at his hands. Writer's hands, she noticed. Ink stains on the fingertips. Calluses from a pen as much as from ranch work. Because this ranch needs more than 3 men who can barely keep themselves alive. Because Eli has not smiled since the war. Because Boone picks fights with fence posts when he is angry. He paused, drew a breath. Because our mother died giving birth to me, and I have spent 24 years trying to give this family back something I took from it. Clara looked at this young man, this youngest brother, who carried a guilt. He had been born into a grief he had inherited with his first breath, and she saw in him something she recognized, the desperate need to fix a family that was broken in places no one could see. You need to tell Eli, she said. I know. Tomorrow morning, I will tell him. But tomorrow came faster than either of them expected. Eli found the letter at dawn. Clara's letter, the one she had written 3 months ago in Boston, addressed to E. Dawson, Copper Creek, carefully folded inside Levi's shirt pocket where it had been carried like a secret. Eli read it standing in the kitchen, his back to the room, and Clara watched his shoulders, those massive shoulders that looked like they could carry the roof of the cabin, go rigid. He turned around. His face was stone. Not angry stone. Something worse. Disappointed stone. Betrayed stone. The face of a man who had trusted his family absolutely and just discovered that trust had a crack running through it. Boone read the situation faster than Clara would have expected from a man known for acting before thinking. His amber eyes went hot. What the hell, Levi, you used Eli's name to bring a stranger here. Eli was colder than Boone, but far more frightening. When Boone was angry, you could see it coming, could brace for it the way you brace for a thunderstorm. When Eli was angry, the temperature in the room simply dropped, and you realized you were standing in the path of something that did not need to shout to be devastating. You had no right, Eli said. Each word was measured, controlled, laid down like stones in a wall. This is my ranch, my name, my decision. Levi stood straight. He was the smallest of the three brothers, but he was still 6 feet 2 inches of Dawson backbone, and he did not flinch. It is our ranch, Eli. Pa left it to all three of us. And I did it because you are dying inside and too stubborn to admit it. The silence that followed was thick enough to cut with a knife. Boone looked between his brothers, jaw-working fists opening and closing at his sides. Clara stood at the edge of the room near the stove, feeling the heat from the firebox at her back and the cold from the confrontation at her front. Then Boone turned to her. You. His voice was blunt as a hammer. What do you want? Straight answer. Clara looked at Boone, those amber eyes burning with the particular fire of a man who protected his family the way a wolf protects its pack. She looked at Eli, those steel gray eyes locked down tight, revealing nothing except the faintest tremor along his jaw that suggested the control was costing him everything he had. She looked at Levi, those green eyes wide with guilt and hope, and the terrible knowledge that he had set something in motion that could not be taken back. 3 brothers. 3 kinds of pain, and her standing in the middle of it with nothing but the clothes on her back and a bruise on her face. I want to not die in the middle of Montana with nothing to my name, she said, and her voice was steadier than she felt. I lost everything yesterday. Everything except my life. Let me stay until the wounded are healed and I can get to Copper Creek. I will cook. I will clean. I will earn my keep. Then I will go and you will never hear from me again. Eli studied her. It was a long look, heavy, thorough. He was measuring her the way a man measures timber before cutting it, deciding if the grain was true, deciding if it would hold. Fine, he said. You stay until they are healed. Then you go. This is not your home. I know, Clara said. Boone crossed his arms over his chest, a wall of muscle and skepticism. And if those bandits come back, then I will deal with it, Eli said. Not a promise, not a boast. A statement of fact delivered in the same tone a man might use to say the sun will rise tomorrow. I keep my word. 4 words. And in those 4 words, Clara heard something she had not heard in a very long time. Certainty, the bedrock kind. The kind that does not bend in the wind or crack in the cold. The kind that a woman who had lost everything could, if she was careful, if she was brave, begin to build upon. She turned back to the stove, poured coffee into 4 tin cups, set them on the table without a word. Eli picked up his cup and drank. Black, no sugar, strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe nail. He looked at her over the rim, and for just a moment, a fraction of a heartbeat so brief she might have imagined it, something in those iron-gray eyes softened. Then he set the cup down, picked up his hat, and walked out the door to begin the day's work. The screen door swung shut behind him. The sound echoed through the cabin like a period at the end of a very long sentence. Clara stood alone in the kitchen of a house that was not hers, surrounded by the possessions of men she did not know, in a territory she had never seen with a future so uncertain it might as well have been written in smoke. But the coffee was hot, the stove was warm, the mountains outside the window were solid and real, and older than anything she could imagine. And somewhere in the back of her mind, beneath the grief and the fear and the exhaustion, a small voice whispered something she was not yet ready to believe. You are going to be all right. She did not know then what she knows now. She did not know about the letter hidden in the root cellar written by a dead man 3 years ago that would change everything. She did not know about Judge Harlan Blackwood, the most dangerous man in the territory who wanted this land badly enough to kill for it. She did not know that the bandits who had burned her stagecoach were not random thieves but hired men working for a purpose she could not yet see. She did not know that the stern, silent, impossibly strong man who had just walked out the door carrying a fence post on one shoulder and a broken heart he told no one about would become the center of her world. That his rough hands would learn gentleness. That his guarded eyes would learn to look at her the way a man looks at the reason he gets up in the morning. She did not know any of this, not yet. All she knew was that the coffee was good, the fire was warm, and for the first time since Boston, she was standing in a kitchen that felt like it might, with enough time and enough care, become something close to home. Outside the window, the Dawson brothers had already begun the day's work. She could hear the rhythmic thud of an axe on wood, the creak of the barn door opening on iron hinges, the low murmur of a voice talking to horses in the gentle, patient tone that men use when they think no one is listening. 3 brothers, a ranch in the mountains, a woman with nothing left to lose. And somewhere out there beyond the pine-covered ridges and the singing creek in the vast blue Montana sky, a storm was gathering. The kind that comes not from clouds but from men with power and greed and the willingness to destroy whatever stands between them and what they want. Clara did not know this yet, but she would. And when the time came, she would discover that the woman who had survived bandits and burning stagecoaches in a 2,000-mile journey into the unknown was stronger than anyone, including herself, had ever imagined. And that was enough. For now, that was enough. The days that followed had a rhythm to them, the way a river has a rhythm. Steady, constant, carrying everything forward, whether you wanted it to move or not. Clara woke each morning before the sun. Not because she had to, because the alternative was lying in the dark with nothing between her and the memories the stagecoach burning the photograph, curling the backhand across her face, and she had learned that idle hands made room for grief to settle in and stay. So she rose. She dressed in the dark, the same navy traveling dress she had been wearing when the world ended, washed and mended now, but still carrying faint stains that would not come out no matter how hard she scrubbed. She walked to the kitchen and built a fire in the wood stove. Shavings first, then kindling, stacked in a loose pyramid, then a split log set on top at an angle to catch the draft. She had watched Eli do it that first morning and memorized the technique, the way she memorized a sewing pattern with her eyes and her hands and her quiet, methodical mind. But every morning when she opened the back door to fetch water from the creek, she found that the porch had already been swept clean. The firewood box beside the stove had already been filled. The water bucket was already sitting on the counter, full to the brim with cold, clear creek water. Eli. Every morning, before anyone else stirred, he never mentioned it. She never thanked him. It became their first unspoken agreement, the foundation of a language they were building together without knowing it, a language made not of words but of small, deliberate acts of care. Clara cooked breakfast at 6. Eggs from the 3 hens that pecked around the yard. Salt pork sliced thin and fried in the heavy cast iron skillet until the edges curled and crisped. Cornmeal cakes mixed from scratch, the batter made with large salt, a pinch of wild sage she had found drying in a braid near the window, poured into a hot greased pan and cooked until the bottom turned golden. And coffee. Always coffee. Strong enough to stand a spoon and black as creek mud, brewed in the battered tin pot that looked like it had survived more Montana winters than any of them. Eli drank his coffee without comment, but he drank 2 cups every morning now, and he held the tin mug with both hands the way a man holds something precious. The days fell into a pattern. Eli and Boone worked outside from dawn to dusk. Fence posts to replace wire to string cattle to move to fresh grazing. The ranch ran 70 head of beef cattle and 12 horses, and the land itself demanded constant labor. Clara would stand at the kitchen window sometimes and watch them work. Eli swung a post maul the way other men breathed, with an effortless, mechanical power that made the 8-pound head look weightless. Every strike landed in exactly the same spot. Every post drove straight and true. Boone worked differently. He was faster than Eli, but less patient, more likely to wrestle a stubborn post into submission through sheer force than to finesse it into place. His energy was kinetic, restless, always moving, always burning. But when he was with the horses, everything changed. Clara watched one afternoon as Boone worked with a young mare who had never been saddled. He stood in the corral with a lasso coiled loosely in one hand, talking to the animal in a voice so low and gentle that Clara could barely hear it from the fence. The mare circled him, ears flicking, nostrils wide. Boone did not chase her. He waited. He spoke. He let the rope hang slack. And after 20 minutes of this patient, quiet conversation between man and horse, the mare walked up to him and pressed her nose against his chest. Boone Dawson was a man of fire. But with horses, the fire became something else entirely. A warmth, a steadiness, a gift. Clara stored this observation away the way she stored everything she learned about these three brothers. Carefully, quietly, in a place where it could be useful later. Levi kept the books. He sat at the kitchen table each afternoon with a ledger and a pencil, recording in expenses, in income, feed costs, and market prices, the careful arithmetic of keeping a ranch alive. He was methodical and precise, his handwriting small and neat, every column perfectly aligned. But Clara noticed that he kept a second book beneath the ledger, a copy of Great Expectations by Charles Dickens, its spine cracked and its pages soft from rereading. One evening, she found the book sitting on the windowsill above the kitchen basin position so she would see it while washing dishes. She picked it up and opened it to the page Levi had marked with a blade of dried grass. That night after supper, she sat on the porch step and read. Levi appeared beside her with a cup of tea and sat down without asking. "What do you think of Pip?" he asked. "I think he spent the whole book looking for something grand when the grandest thing was already in front of him." Levi looked at her with those pale green eyes, the eyes that saw everything, and said little, and something in his expression shifted. Recognition, perhaps. The look of a man who has been speaking a language no one else in his family understands and has suddenly found a translator. "I see you, Clara," he said quietly. "I see someone who reads Dickens while kneading bread. That is not a woman who should be invisible." She did not know what to say to that, so she said nothing. And they sat together in the fading light, reading in silence, and it was the most peaceful hour Clara had spent since leaving Boston. Boone was harder to reach. He did not trust her. Not because he thought she was dangerous, but because Boone Dawson did not trust easily, and the arrival of a stranger in his home, a stranger invited by his youngest brother, using their oldest brother's name felt like a violation of the one thing Boone valued above all else: family, the boundary of it, the sanctity of it, the absolute unbreakable circle of it. On the fourth morning, Boone sat down at the breakfast table, picked up his fork, took a bite of cornmeal cake, and frowned. "Needs salt." The kitchen went still. Eli looked up from his coffee. Levi stopped chewing. Clara set down the spatula. She turned from the stove and looked Boone directly in the eyes. He was a foot taller than her and outweighed her by at least 100 pounds, and his amber eyes were hot with the perpetual challenge that seemed to be his resting state. "Then get up at 4:30 and cook it yourself, Mr. Dawson." The silence was absolute. The fire popped in the stove. A horse whinnied outside. Somewhere in the distance, a hawk screamed. Boone stared at her. His jaw tightened. His nostrils flared. And then he laughed. Not a mocking laugh, not a dismissive laugh, a real laugh surprised out of him like a cork popped from a bottle. It transformed his face, softening the hard angles, making him look 10 years younger and infinitely less dangerous. "Fair enough." He reached for the salt cellar, passed the salt. From that morning on, the dynamic shifted. Boone still did not trust Clara, but he respected her. And Boone Dawson showed respect the only way he knew how, through action. Extra firewood appeared by the kitchen door, split and stacked without comment. A rattlesnake was dispatched from the garden before Clara stepped outside. A loaded rifle appeared propped against the wall near the back door, positioned where she could reach it quickly. He never said a word about any of it. He did not need to. The snake, the firewood, and the rifle said everything. And then there was Eli. Eli who avoided her the way a man avoids a wound he knows will hurt if he touches it. Eli who left the room when she entered it, who spoke to her only when necessary, who looked at her only when he thought she could not see him looking. But Clara saw. She saw everything. The porch swept clean each morning. His work. The water bucket filled before dawn. His work. The extra blanket that appeared on her bed when the October nights turned cold. His work. The loose step on the porch that she had tripped on the first week repaired overnight without a word. His work. Elijah Dawson was the kind of man who would never say, "I care about you," with words. He said it with firewood stacked before dawn and a porch swept clean and a step repaired in the dark, so a woman he barely knew would not stumble. He said it with actions so small and so steady that they could have been missed entirely if not for the fact that Clara Whitfield had spent her whole life learning to read the silences between words. And what she read in Eli's silences was a man who was terrified of what he felt and had no idea what to do about it. One afternoon in the second week, Eli appeared at the woodpile where Clara was attempting with more determination than skill to split around a ponderosa pine. She had been at it for 20 minutes and had succeeded mostly in embedding the axe head at an angle that refused to go deeper or come loose. Eli watched from 6 feet away, arms crossed, expression unreadable. Then he stepped forward and put his hand over hers on the axe handle. "Not there, here." He repositioned her grip, his rough fingers adjusting hers with a precision that surprised her. "Hold it at the end. Let the weight of the head do the work. You are fighting the wood. Do not fight it. Work with the grain." He was standing behind her, close. She could feel the warmth of him through the thin fabric of her dress, could smell wood smoke and leather, and the clean, sharp scent of pine sap on his skin. His hands covered hers completely, and for a moment the axe, the woodpile, the entire state of Montana ceased to exist. There was only the sound of his breathing and the press of his chest against her back, and the realization that her heart was beating so fast she was certain he could feel it through the handle of the axe. "Now lift, slow, let it come up to here." He guided the axe overhead. "And bring it down smooth. Follow through." She swung. The axe hit the round dead center and split it in 2 clean halves that fell away on either side with its satisfying crack. Clara turned to look at him, still standing close, his hands still near hers. For one suspended moment, neither of them moved. His gray eyes held something she had not seen before. Not the carefully maintained distance, not the iron control, something raw and unfinished and entirely human. Then Boone's voice rang across the yard from the barn. "If you two are done destroying firewood, supper is getting cold." Eli stepped back. The wall came up. The moment passed. But Clara carried the warmth of it for the rest of the day, and that night when she lay in her bed listening to the wind press against the cabin walls, she touched her own hands where his had been and felt the ghost of his grip like a brand that would not fade. During Eli's absence, Clara discovered something else. Something she was not looking for and almost wished she had not found. She was sweeping under Eli's cot when her broom struck a wooden box pushed against the far wall. Inside were letters, dozens of them, written in Eli's careful, slanted hand on rough paper. Every one of them addressed the same way. "Dear Alice." Clara did not read them. She wanted to. Every instinct told her these letters held the key to understanding the man who had swept her porch and filled her water bucket and looked at her across the firelight with eyes that said everything his mouth refused to. But they were his grief, his private conversation with a ghost. And Clara Whitfield, who knew what it meant to have her private things ripped from her hands and thrown into fire, would not violate that boundary. She put the box back. She finished sweeping. And that evening she asked Levi. Levi set down his book and was quiet for a long time. "Alice Mercer," he said finally. "Daniel Mercer's widow. Eli's best friend from the war. The one who died at Vicksburg." He paused. "Eli has been writing letters to her for 10 years. One updating them every on. He tells her about the ranch, the seasons, the price of cattle, the way the aspens turn gold in October. He writes to her as if Daniel were still alive and she is simply waiting for news. He has never sent any of them, not one, because sending them would mean facing her, and facing her would mean admitting that he failed. He promised Daniel he would look after Alice and the boy. Instead, he came here and hid in these mountains for a decade, writing letters to a woman who does not know he exists. Clara felt her heart crack open. Not with pity. Pity would have been an insult to a man like Eli. What she felt was something far more dangerous. She felt love. Deep, certain, irreversible love for a man who wrote letters to a dead friend's wife every month for 10 years because loyalty was the only language he knew and grief was the only conversation he could manage. She loved Elijah Dawson. She loved him the way you love a mountain. Not because it is beautiful, though it is, but because it is there. Solid, unmovable, permanent. The kind of thing you orient your entire life around and never question. The realization did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like dawn, slowly, inevitably, until the whole sky was full of it and there was no pretending it was still dark. 2 weeks into her stay on a night when a storm rolled down from the Bitterroot Range with a fury that shook the cabin walls, Clara learned what haunted Elijah Dawson. She woke to the sound of screaming. Not the scream of someone in danger, something worse. The scream of someone trapped in a place they cannot escape, a place that exists only in memory, where the dead are still dying and the blood is still warm, and there is nothing you can do to stop any of it. She was out of bed and at his door before she was fully awake. The door was ajar. Inside, Eli sat on the edge of his cot, his massive body hunched forward, his hands gripping the wooden frame so hard the joints of his fingers had gone white. His eyes were open, but they were not seeing this room, this cabin, this Montana night. They were seeing something 10 years gone. A battlefield, a friend's face. Eli, she spoke from the doorway, softly, the way you speak to an animal that has been hurt and does not know yet whether you are friend or threat. Eli, you are home. You are safe. He blinked. Once. Twice. His eyes found her face in the dim light, and she watched the present come back to him in slow, painful degrees like a man surfacing from deep water. Clara, you were dreaming. He ran a hand over his face, dragging his palm across the stubble on his jaw. His skin was sheened with sweat despite the cold. I am fine. Go back to sleep. You are not fine, and I am not going anywhere. She sat down on the floor beside his cot, not on the bed, on the floor, close enough to be present, far enough to not invade. And she waited, because Clara Whitfield understood something that most people never learn. That sometimes the bravest thing you can do for another person is simply to stay and to be quiet and to let the silence make room for truth. It took a long time. The storm raged outside. The fire in the main room had burned down to embers and the cabin was cold, and neither of them moved to stoke it. Then Eli spoke. Vicksburg, he said. The word came out like something being pulled from deep inside his chest with a hook. I dream about Vicksburg, my best friend, Daniel Mercer. He died in my arms. He was 23 years old and he had a wife named Alice and a son he had never met, and I held him while he bled out in the mud, and I could not stop it. I tried. God help me, I tried. He looked down at his hands, those enormous, scarred, capable hands that could split a fence post with 3 swings of a maul and gentle a frightened horse, and build a cabin that would stand for 100 years. Sometimes I still feel his blood on my hands. Clara did not say, I understand. She did not understand. She had never held a dying friend. She had never been to war. She had no right to claim that kind of knowledge. Instead, she said the only thing she could think of that was true and honest and not an insult to his pain. Tell me how he lived, not how he died. Something changed in Eli's eyes. The wall, that impenetrable wall of stone and steel and silence that he had built around himself over a decade of solitude and grief, developed a crack. Just a hairline fracture, just enough for the light to get through. And he told her about Daniel Mercer, the terrible jokes, the singing in the rain, the letters to Alice read aloud by campfire, the dream of a farm in Iowa with a porch and a bonnet and enough children to fill every room. Clara shared too, her parents, the fever, the loneliness of Boston after they were gone. Pemberton with his wet hands and his dead wives in the wedding dress she had left on the bed when she climbed out the window at 3 in the morning. You came 2,000 miles to marry a stranger, Eli asked. No judgment. Only the particular bewilderment of a man trying to understand an act of faith he was not sure he was capable of. I came 2,000 miles to choose my own life. They talked until dawn painted the window amber, And when Clara rose to return to her room, she felt Eli's fingers brush the back of her hand. A touch so light it might have been imagined. A butterfly landing. A ghost passing through. "Thank you," he said, "for staying." She understood that he was not talking about tonight. "Winter always ends, Eli," she said softly, "even the ones inside." Then she left him alone with the dawn and whatever small, dangerous thing it had just begun growing in the space between them. 4 days later, Clara's brother arrived. Nolan Whitfield drove a supply wagon into the yard at mid-morning, jumped down before the wheels stopped turning, and caught Clara in a hug that lifted her clean off her feet. "Thank God," he said into her hair. "When I got word about the stagecoach, I thought I had lost you too." Nolan was 33, 10 years older than Clara, with hair going silver and the same green eyes she saw in the mirror. He had come to Montana 2 years ago after his wife died of consumption, looking for a place where the air did not taste like grief. The Garrett family would return to Copper Creek with Nolan. Walt was healing. Henderson was on his feet. Mary Garrett had stopped the terrible keening sound and was now silent in a way that was worse, a silence that carried inside it all the years she would spend without William. Clara should have been packing. She should have been climbing into that wagon and riding toward Copper Creek in the trading post where her brother had a room waiting for her. That was the plan. That was always the plan. But then Boone came around the corner of the barn with his face the color of ash. 3 more cattle dead this morning. Poisoned. And I found this nailed to the gate. He held up a piece of paper. Clara could read the words from 10 feet away because they were written large and deliberate in crude black letters. "Sell or burn. You choose." The silence in the yard was enormous. The mountains stood around them like witnesses. The creek kept singing, indifferent to the cruelty of men. "I am staying," Clara said. Every head turned. Nolan spoke first. "Clara, no, you need to come with me. This is not safe." Eli spoke second, and his voice was flat and hard. "This is not your fight. You do not owe us anything." Clara turned to face Eli. She had to tilt her head back to look him in the eyes. This man, who stood a full 14 inches taller than her, this man built like the mountains, this man who hid a bleeding heart behind a wall of iron silence. And she felt something rise in her chest that she had been pushing down for 2 weeks. "Do not tell me what is my fight and what is not." Her voice shook, but it did not break. "Someone is threatening your home. I know what it feels like to lose everything. I lived it 3 days ago, standing beside a burning stagecoach with my parents' photograph turning to ash. So do not you dare stand there and tell me to look the other way while someone does to your family what those bandits did to mine." The silence that followed was the loudest sound Clara had ever heard. Boone looked at her with something new in his amber eyes. Not the grudging tolerance of the past 2 weeks, something deeper, something that looked impossibly like admiration. Levi covered his mouth with his hand, but Clara could see the smile behind it. Eli just stared, his jaw worked. Something in his steel gray eyes shifted tectonically like a fault line moving deep underground. "Fine," he said at last, "but you follow my rules. You do not go anywhere alone. If things get dangerous, you will keep me safe. I know. I keep my word." Clara watched Nolan's wagon disappear over the ridge with the Garrett family, Walt and Henderson. She watched until the dust settled and the prairie swallowed them whole. Then she turned back to the cabin and the 3 brothers and the life she was choosing with every breath. That night she saw riders on the ridge above the ranch. 3 dark silhouettes against the fading light, motionless, watching. She told no one, but she did not sleep. And she kept Eli's rifle within arm's reach until dawn. What came next happened fast. Boone rode to Copper Creek for supplies and came back with information that changed everything. He gathered the brothers and Clara around the kitchen table, his amber eyes burning like forged coals. "Judge Harlan Blackwood," Boone said. "He has been buying every ranch in this valley. The Hendersons sold last month below market. The Porters before them. Anyone who does not sell gets trouble. Poisoned cattle, barn fires, fences cut in the night." He looked at Eli. "And any stagecoach carrying settlers into the area gets hit by bandits. Sound familiar?" The words settled over the room like cold water. The stagecoach robbery had not been random. The bandits who had burned Clara's belongings and killed William Garrett and taken her mother's cameo brooch were not common thieves. They were employees, working for a man named Blackwood, working to keep settlers away from land that Blackwood wanted to control. He has filed a challenge against our land deed at the county office, Boone continued. Claims Pa's original filing was improper, and the judge reviewing the case happens to be Blackwood's cousin. Clara felt something stir in the back of her mind. Blackwood. The name was familiar. Not from Montana, from somewhere else. From a letter written in shaking handwriting on a bed where a man was dying. Her father's letter, the one she had tucked into the lining of her suitcase before climbing out that window in Boston. The one that had burned with everything else. Blackwood, she said. My father mentioned that name in a letter he wrote before he died. Ezra Blackwood owed my family money. He fled west in 1865 without paying. Eli looked at her sharply. Ezra Blackwood, Harlan's father. The connections fell into place like tumblers in a lock. 2 families, 2 debts, 2,000 miles apart. And the thread that connected them ran straight through this kitchen table where 4 people sat with the weight of the truth settling over them. He wants our land, Eli said. But why? It is good land, but not worth this kind of trouble. Nobody had an answer. Not yet. But the answer was there. 30 feet below them in the root cellar, sealed in a tin box wrapped in oilcloth, a dead man's letter was waiting. The attack came on a Tuesday night, 3 hours after moonrise. Clara woke to the sound of gunfire. Not distant gunfire. Close. Bullets striking the log walls of the cabin with flat, heavy impacts that shook dust from the rafters. Get down! Eli's voice cut through the dark with the authority of a man who had commanded soldiers in battle. Boone east window, Levi back door, Clara stay on the floor and do not move. The cabin erupted into controlled chaos. Eli grabbed his Winchester and moved to the front window in a low crouch. Boone was already at the east wall, shoving the barrel of his rifle through the firing slit that had been cut into the logs for exactly this purpose. Outside, muzzle flashes lit the tree line like fireflies from hell. A torch arced through the darkness and landed on the barn roof. The dry shingles caught immediately, flames racing along the ridgeline, turning the night orange. The horses, Levi shouted, and before Eli could stop him, he was out the back door and running toward the barn. Clara did not stay on the floor. She crawled to the kitchen window and looked out. 4 riders she counted, not 6 like the stagecoach attack, 4, and they were firing in rotation one at a time, making it sound like more. This was not a killing assault. This was intimidation. Pressure. The squeeze before the break. Eli, she called, they are not trying to kill us. They are trying to scare us into leaving. Eli glanced at her, a fraction of a second of eye contact in the middle of chaos. And in that fraction, she saw something she had not seen before. Not anger, not fear, trust. He trusted her judgment. She is right. Conserve ammunition. Covering fire only. The gunfight lasted 20 minutes. When the riders finally retreated into the darkness, the barn was half consumed, the yard was littered with spent casings, and Levi was on his hands and knees in the corral, coughing smoke, his eyebrows singed but alive. He had gotten all 4 horses out seconds before the roof collapsed. Clara had run outside to pull him clear when the burning roof beam fell. She had not thought about it. She had simply moved the way the body moves when someone you care about is in danger without permission from the brain. Eli found them in the yard afterward. Clara, her face black with soot, her hair wild, her dress torn. Levi dazed and smoke-stained, but grinning. The 4 horses standing in a protective circle around both of them. Eli looked at Clara, and what she saw in his steel-gray eyes was no longer guarded or cautious or controlled. What she saw was the raw, unfiltered terror of a man who had just watched someone he cared about run into a burning building and come out alive by a margin so thin it barely existed. He did not touch her. He did not speak. He simply stood there, breathing, his massive hands opening and closing at his sides. And Clara understood that Elijah Dawson was fighting the most important battle of his life. Not against the bandits, against himself. Against every wall he had built, and every door he had locked, and every feeling he had buried in the 10 years since a friend bled to death in his arms. The next morning, Clara went into the root cellar to check for damage. In the far corner, behind a row of mason jars filled with preserved vegetables, she found a tin box wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a letter in a hand she did not recognize, strong, and slanted the handwriting of a man who had spent his life holding tools, not pens. For my sons, to be opened when the time is right. Henry Dawson, December 1870. She brought it upstairs and placed it on the kitchen table. The three brothers stood around it, and Eli opened the envelope with hands that trembled, despite his efforts to keep them still. This was their father's voice reaching across death to tell them what he had never had the chance to say in life. The letter revealed three things. First, there was copper beneath the ranch. Henry had discovered it in 1868 while digging a new well, a significant deposit potentially worth a fortune. Second, Henry had registered the deed and mineral rights at the federal land office in Helena, not the county office where Blackwood had influence. The federal office where the filing was beyond any local judge's authority to challenge. Third, a warning. A man named Blackwood approached me in 1869 and offered to buy this land at 10 times its value. When I refused, he made threats. If anything happens to me, investigate Blackwood. Henry Dawson had died of pneumonia in 1871, or so they had been told. Clara looked at Eli's face as the implications settled in, and she saw the grief transform into something harder and more dangerous. Purpose. We need that federal filing from Helena, Eli said. If we can prove the deed is registered at the federal level, Blackwood's county challenge is worthless. I will ride to Helena, Boone offered. No. Eli's voice brooked no argument. I will go. Boone, you stay here and guard the ranch. Levi, ride to Copper Creek and bring the sheriff. What about me? Clara asked. You stay here, with Boone. He said it standing on the porch at dawn, his saddlebags packed, his horse waiting. The sky was just beginning to lighten along the eastern ridgeline. Clara stood in front of him, having to crane her neck to meet his eyes. I need to know you are safe while I am gone, Eli said, and his voice, that deep, rough, carefully controlled voice, had a crack in it that had not been there before. That is the only way I can do what needs to be done. Please. Please, a word Clara had never heard Eli Dawson use with anyone. Come back, she said. 2 words. Light as air. Heavy as the mountains. I keep my word. He held her gaze for one more heartbeat. Then he mounted his horse and rode north without looking back. And Clara stood on the porch and watched him go, and realized with a clarity that felt like stepping into cold water that she was in love with a man who might never know how to love her back. The 3 days without Eli were the longest of Clara's life. She and Boone kept the ranch running. They worked in a wary, efficient partnership, 2 people who had not chosen each other's company, but who understood that survival sometimes meant setting aside preference in favor of necessity. On the second night, sitting on the porch with rifles across their laps, keeping watch in a darkness thick enough to touch, Boone spoke in a voice Clara had never heard from him. Quiet, almost hesitant. The voice of a man lowering a weapon he had been carrying so long, he had forgotten it was there. Can I tell you something I have never told anyone? Of course. I am scared. All the time. Not of Blackwood, not of the bandits. I am scared that I will spend my whole life as Eli's shadow. That I will never know if I can stand on my own 2 feet. Clara looked at him in the darkness with his rifle across his knees and his face turned toward the mountains. Boone Dawson did not look wild or dangerous or angry. He looked like a 26-year-old man who had been carrying a question his whole life and had never found anyone safe enough to ask it to. What would you want to do if you could do anything, horses? The word came out fast, as if he had been holding it behind his teeth for years. I am good with horses, Clara, really good. I want to breed them, train them, build something of my own. Something that is mine, not Eli's, not the family's, just mine. Have you told Eli? Eli does not listen. He decides things and the rest of us follow, and that is how it has been since Pa died. Maybe since before that, since the war took whatever softness he had and left nothing but duty and fence posts. Maybe he does not listen because nobody has tried speaking loud enough. Boone was silent for a long moment. The stars turned overhead, brilliant and cold in the thin mountain air. A coyote called from somewhere down the valley, and another answered from the ridge, and the 2 voices wove together in the darkness like a conversation about hunger and distance and the long wait for dawn. Then he made a sound that might have been a laugh. You know, for someone who weighs about 100 pounds soaking wet, you have a real talent for hitting people exactly where it hurts. I take that as a compliment. It was meant as one. He shifted the rifle on his knees, checked the chamber by feel without looking, and settled back against the porch post. You are good for this family, Clara. I did not want to think so. But you are. Levi was right about that, at least. Even if his method was pure horse manure. It was the closest thing to acceptance that Boone Dawson had ever offered anyone. And Clara understood the weight of it because she understood the man. Boone did not give his loyalty easily, but once given it was absolute, unbreakable. The kind of loyalty that would ride through a storm to rescue you or stand in an empty yard with shaking hands and plan a stampede to save your life. The third day, Clara was in the garden behind the cabin pulling late-season squash from the vines when the sound of hooves brought her head up fast. 3 riders, coming through the tree line from the south, not Eli, not the sheriff. The man in front was riding a black horse. Big man, wide shoulders, a face she would never forget because it was the last face she had seen before the backhand that split her lip in the photograph burning in the fire. Virgil Hollister smiled when he saw her. Well, well, the little Boston bird survived. Clara dropped the squash and turned to run, but 2 more riders had already circled behind the cabin. She was boxed in. No escape, no weapon. 20 feet from the back door, and it might as well have been 20 miles. Boone heard the commotion and came around the corner of the cabin at a dead run, his Winchester up and leveled. But Hollister had a knife pressed against Clara's throat before Boone could draw a bead. Drop it, cowboy, or the girl bleeds. Boone's amber eyes went from fire to ice. He stood perfectly still, the rifle aimed at Hollister's chest, his finger on the trigger, every muscle in his body locked in the battle between what he wanted to do and what he could afford to do. He set the rifle on the ground, slowly. His jaw was clenched so tight Clara could hear his teeth grinding. Nobody touches my family, Boone said. His voice was quiet, which was somehow more frightening than any shout. It was the quiet of a man making a promise he intended to keep with his bare hands if necessary. Hollister laughed. Tell your brother, the big one, bring the deed to Judge Blackwood's estate by sundown tomorrow. Or the girl disappears, and I do not mean to a nunnery. They put Clara on a horse. They rode south. Boone stood in the empty yard with his hands shaking and his brother's rifle at his feet. Eli was 100 miles away. Clara was gone, and the sun was already past noon. Boone did not panic. Boone Dawson was many things: hot-tempered, impulsive, quick to anger. But when the people he loved were in danger, all of that burned away, and what was left underneath was pure Dawson iron. He saddled the fastest horse in the corral and rode to Copper Creek in 2 hours flat. He found Levi and Sheriff Morrison and Clara's brother Nolan, and the 4 of them sat in the back of Nolan's store and made a plan. Clara, meanwhile, was not waiting to be rescued. They had locked her in a room on the 2nd floor of Judge Blackwood's stone house, the largest building in the territory. The room was absurdly elegant velvet curtains, a 4-poster bed, a Persian carpet. But the windows had iron bars and the door was bolted from outside with a lock the size of Clara's fist. Blackwood visited her once. A man of 50 with silver hair combed back from a high forehead and a voice like poisoned honey. He spoke with the courteous menace of someone who had never needed to raise his voice because he had always had other people to do his violence for him. Miss Whitfield, I have been working to acquire the Dawson property for 5 years. Everyone has a price. For the Dawson boys, that price appears to be you. Clara looked at him with steady blue eyes and said nothing, because she was already looking at the fireplace. The fireplace was old built when the house was smaller. The chimney was narrow, made of rough brick, unlined. Too small for a man, too small for most women. Clara Whitfield was 5 feet 3 inches tall and weighed 108 pounds. She waited until midnight. She removed her shoes. She tore strips from her petticoat and wrapped her hands and knees. She bent down, looked up into the dark shaft of the chimney, and began to climb. It was the most terrifying thing she had ever done. Worse than the stagecoach. Worse than the bandits. In the chimney there was nothing but darkness, total and absolute, in walls so close they pressed against her shoulders on both sides. Soot fell into her eyes, her mouth, her nose. The bricks scraped skin from her palms through the cloth wrapping. She could not look up. She could not look down. She could only feel her way 1 inch at a time, wedging her feet against the rough brick, pushing with her back. her knees, her bleeding hands. Halfway up, she got stuck. A protruding brick caught her left shoulder and held her. She could not move up. She could not slide down. The panic hit her like a wave, cold sweat and shortened breath, and the overwhelming animal certainty that she was going to die in this chimney and nobody would ever know. Breathe, breathe slow, squeeze, do not pull. Eli's voice. In her head, steady and deep and certain, the voice he had used when he taught her to chop wood, when he stood behind her and placed his hands over hers and showed her how to let the weight do the work. She breathed. She twisted her shoulder 45 degrees. She squeezed past the brick. She kept climbing. Her hands were bleeding through the wrappings now, leaving dark smears on the bricks, and her knees were bruised to the bone, and there was soot in her lungs and tears cutting tracks through the black on her face. But she thought about Eli, about the cabin, about the coffee in the morning and the porch swept clean before dawn, about the life she wanted to build. And she kept climbing. She emerged on the roof into starlight and cold mountain air, so clean it stung her ravaged lungs. She slid down the back of the house, dropped into a row of bushes, and crawled toward the tree line. She almost made it. Going somewhere, little bird Virgil Hollister stood between her and the pines, his knife catching moonlight. And then the earth shook. Boone's plan, the stampede, Blackwood's own cattle, 200 head, driven toward the estate from the south by Levi and Nolan on horseback, whooping and firing into the air. The thunder of 400 hooves shook the ground like an earthquake, and Hollister's men scattered to save the livestock because a stampede does not negotiate and it does not take prisoners. Hollister turned toward the sound. 1 second of distraction. Enough. Boone came out of the darkness like a fist thrown by God himself. One punch perfectly placed snapped Hollister's head back and dropped him in the dirt. Sheriff Morrison was 2 steps behind, iron cuffs ready. Boone stood over the fallen outlaw, breathing hard, his knuckles split and bleeding. Then he turned to Clara. "Are you hurt?" She stood there in the moonlight, covered in soot from head to toe, her dress torn, her hands wrapped in bloody rags, her hair a wild tangle of honey blonde and chimney black. "I was already escaping it when you showed up." Boone Dawson laughed, a real laugh, full and open, the laugh of a man who has discovered something he did not expect and is delighted by it. The laugh reached all the way to his amber eyes and lit them up like lanterns. "Of course you were." Eli Dawson rode through the night. He had left Helena at sundown with the federal land deed folded inside his shirt, pressed against his chest, next to a heart that had not beaten this hard since Vicksburg. He rode through mountain passes where the trail narrowed to a thread of packed dirt between granite walls. He rode through pine forests so dark and dense that the stars disappeared, and the only sound was hooves on stone and his own breathing and the vast indifferent silence of the Montana wilderness. He had received the message at the Helena land office. A rider, half dead from exhaustion, had come in with a note written in Boone's jagged handwriting. 4 words: "Clara taken, come now." Eli did not eat. He did not sleep. He changed horses at a relay station outside of Garrison and left money on the counter without waiting for change. He pushed the second horse harder than any animal should be pushed, and somewhere around midnight, crossing a creek swollen with early autumn rain, the horse stumbled and Eli went into the water up to his chest. He came up gasping, the deed still dry inside his shirt because he had wrapped it in oilcloth, and he mounted and kept riding. He was not thinking about the deed. He was not thinking about Blackwood or the copper beneath his land or the legal battle that would decide his family's future. He was thinking about a woman with cornflower blue eyes and honey blonde hair and a bruise on her cheekbone who had stood in front of a burning stagecoach and refused to fall. He was thinking about the way she made coffee in the morning, strong enough to dissolve a horseshoe nail, and how she had somehow known that was exactly how he needed it without ever being told. He was thinking about her hand on his, adjusting his grip on the axe handle, and the sound of her voice in the dark saying words that had cracked something open inside him that he had spent 10 years sealing shut. Winter always ends, even the ones inside. He reached Copper Creek at dawn. The sky was the color of a fresh bruised purple and gray, and the town was just beginning to stir. He pulled up in front of the sheriff's office, and Boone was already there, standing on the boardwalk with his arms crossed and his amber eyes burning holes in the morning. "Where is she?" Eli's voice was raw from the cold and the riding and the fear he would not admit to. "Blackwood's estate. We got her out last night. She is at Nolan's store. She is safe." Eli did not wait for more. He spurred his horse down the main street toward the general store at the far end of town. He dismounted before the animal stopped, tied the reins to the hitching post with hands that had stopped shaking sometime around 3 in the morning because there was nothing left to shake with, and pushed through the door. Clara was sitting at a table near the back of the store, a blanket around her shoulders, a cup of tea in her hands. Nolan stood beside her. Levi sat across from her, his face creased with worry. Sheriff Morrison was writing something in a ledger near the counter. She looked up when his door opened. She was covered in soot. Her hair, that honey blonde hair that caught the light like something from a painting, was matted and gray with chimney ash. Her dress was torn at the shoulder and the hem. Her hands were wrapped in strips of cloth, dark stains showing through where the bricks had scraped skin from her palms. There was a smudge of black across her forehead and another along her jaw. She was the most beautiful thing Eli Dawson had ever seen. She stood up. The blanket fell from her shoulders. She looked at him across the length of the room, and everything that needed to be said passed between them in that silence. Every swept porch, every filled water bucket, every blanket placed in the dark, every almost touch, every word swallowed, every night spent on opposite sides of a wall, listening to each other breathe. Clara crossed the room. She did not walk. She ran. Eli caught her. His arms closed around her, and he lifted her clean off the floor, pressed her against his chest, buried his face in her hair. She smelled like soot and cold sweat, and something underneath it all that was simply Clara, warm and alive and here. His hands were shaking again. His whole body was shaking. This man who could split a fence post with 3 swings and stare down armed bandits without blinking was trembling like a leaf in a wind he could not control. "I am sorry." His voice broke on the second word. "I should have been here. I should have protected you. I should have. You are here now." She pulled back just enough to look up at his face. "That is all that matters." He set her down but did not let go. His hands moved to her face, enormous and rough and infinitely careful, tilting her chin up so he could look into her eyes. His thumbs traced the line of her jaw, wiping soot from her skin, the way a man wipes dust from something he has been keeping in a box for years because he was afraid it would break if he touched it. "I do not know how to say this." His voice was rough as gravel, halting each word, dragged up from somewhere deep and reluctant. "I have never been good with words. I have spent 10 years not saying things because saying them makes them real, and real things can be taken away. But I cannot, Clara, I cannot lose you. Not now, not ever. This ranch, this land, none of it means anything without you in it." "Eli, let me finish, because I may never have the courage to say this again." He drew a breath so deep she could feel his chest expand against her palms. "Levi wrote that advertisement using my name. He was wrong to do it. But he was not wrong about what I needed. I needed you. I have needed you since the day you stood in front of that burning stagecoach and refused to break. Since the day you told me to let the weight do the work. Since the night you sat on my floor and asked me to tell you how Daniel lived instead of how he died." He paused. "I am not a good man, Clara. I am rough and broken, and I do not know how to be gentle. But I am a man who keeps his word. And my word is that I will spend every day I have left on this earth trying to deserve you." Clara placed her hand against his bearded cheek. She felt his jaw clench beneath her palm, felt the muscles working, felt the cost of what he had just said in the tremor that ran through him like a current. "I am not going anywhere, Eli." Her voice was steady and quiet and certain. "Everywhere else is nowhere without you." He kissed her. Not the way she had imagined a first kiss might happen, not smooth or practiced or confident. He kissed her the way a man drinks water after crossing a desert, with his whole body, with desperate gratitude, with the knowledge that he had almost died without knowing what this tasted like. His lips were rough and warm and slightly chapped from the long ride, and his beard scratched her chin, and his hands on her face were trembling. It was, Clara thought, the most honest kiss in the history of kissing. No performance, no technique, just a man who had finally stopped fighting himself. When they pulled apart, his forehead rested against hers. "You are home now," he whispered. And for the first time, those 3 words were not a statement. They were a promise. The trial took place 2 weeks later in Copper Creek. A federal judge traveled from Helena to preside because Judge Blackwood could not judge his own case, and his cousin had been removed from the bench pending investigation. Eli presented the federal deed. The filing was clean, legal, incontestable. Henry Dawson had registered his claim and mineral rights at the Territorial Land Office in Helena in 1860, and every renewal had been properly filed. Blackwood's county challenge had no standing against a federal registration. Clara testified. She sat in a straight-backed wooden chair in the front of the crowded meeting hall that served as Copper Creek's courtroom. Her hands folded in her lap, her blue eyes steady. She described the stagecoach attack, the burning of her belongings, the death of William Garrett. She described the threats, the poisoned cattle, the night attack on the ranch. She described Virgil Hollister pressing a knife to her throat and the words he had spoken. She described her captivity in Blackwood's estate and the chimney she had climbed to escape. When Blackwood's lawyer attempted to discredit her, the words fell flat in the packed room. Miss Whitfield, you came to Montana as a mail-order bride, a woman of, shall we say, uncertain circumstances. Is that really the foundation for credible testimony? Clara looked at the lawyer with the calm, direct gaze of a woman who had survived bandits, escaped a chimney, and faced down 3 mountain men before breakfast. I came to Montana to choose my own life. The method of my arrival does not change the truth of what I witnessed. And if uncertain circumstances disqualified a witness race, then half the people in this territory would be unable to testify about anything. Laughter rippled through the courtroom. The judge suppressed a smile. Blackwood's lawyer sat down. The verdict was swift. Harlan Blackwood was found guilty of conspiracy, kidnapping, extortion, and the hiring of armed men to commit robbery and murder. The Dawson deed was confirmed. The mineral rights were upheld. Virgil Hollister and his men were sentenced to the territorial prison. Outside the courtroom, standing in the autumn sunlight, with the mountains rising golden blue behind her, Clara looked at the land and did not see a place where she had been stranded. She saw home. Eli stood beside her. He did not say anything. He simply took her hand and held it. His rough fingers laced through hers, and together they looked at the future. You are home now. I know, I have been for a while. The wedding happened on a Tuesday evening in the cabin in front of the fireplace Eli had built with stones from the creek. He had ridden to Copper Creek that morning and returned with the Reverend Whitmore, a thin man with kind eyes who had performed every wedding and funeral in the territory for the past 8 years. Nolan came too, looking worried until he saw Clara's face, and then he just laughed and shook his head. You have that same stubborn look Mama used to get when she had made up her mind about something. Are you angry? Angry, Clara, you are glowing. I have not seen that look on your face in years. He glanced across the room at Eli, who was standing by the mantel with his brothers, wearing his cleanest shirt and an expression of barely controlled terror. He is a good man, rough as these mountains, but solid as them too. The ceremony was simple. Boone and Levi stood beside Eli. Nolan stood beside Clara. She wore the only dress she owned, the navy traveling dress that still carried the faintest ghost of chimney soot in its seams no matter how many times she washed it. Eli wore a dark shirt buttoned to the collar and his best pair of boots, which were still ranch boots, but had been oiled to something approaching a shine. There were no rings. Eli took a thin leather cord, the kind he used to mend tack, and tied it around Clara's finger with a knot so precise it could have been made by a jeweler. I will find you something better, he said. I do not want something better, she said. I want this. The Reverend spoke the words. Eli said his vows in a voice that cracked only once on the word love, because it was a word he had not spoken aloud in over a decade, and it felt strange in his mouth, like a language he had forgotten and was just now remembering. Clara said hers without wavering. She had come 2,000 miles to say them, and she meant every syllable. After Nolan and the Reverend left, after Boone and Levi had retreated to their rooms with the particular careful loudness of men trying to give privacy without acknowledging it, Eli lifted Clara over the threshold of the bedroom that was now theirs. The door closed softly behind them. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall, small, dry flakes that hissed against the cabin windows like whispered secrets. When morning came, the world had changed. Not the mountains, not the sky, not the creek rushing over its stones, but everything between Eli and Clara. Everything was new. That first winter was the hardest Clara had ever lived through, and the happiest. The snow came in October and did not leave until April. Drifts piled against the cabin walls until the windows on the north side were buried. The temperature dropped so far below zero that the creek froze solid, and the horses had to be brought into the barn at night to keep from dying. But inside the cabin, the fire burned, and Clara cooked, and Eli carved chess pieces from pine wood, because Clara had mentioned once that she had always wanted to learn. She taught him to dance in the small space between the table and the fireplace, humming waltz melodies she remembered from church socials in Boston, and they were terrible at it, both of them bumping into furniture and stepping on each other's feet, and they laughed until their sides hurt. From the back room, Boone's voice would carry through the wall. Some of us are trying to sleep, and Eli would almost smile. Almost. Close enough that Clara could see the shape of it in the corners of his mouth and the crinkle at the edges of his eyes, and she knew she would spend the rest of her life trying to coax that smile all the way into the open. Every morning, Clara made coffee the way Eli liked it. Black, strong enough to stand a spoon in. She placed his cup on the table before he came inside from the morning chores, and every morning he picked it up and drank it with both hands, wrapped around the tin, and every morning the look he gave her over the rim said more than any love poem ever written. One evening, sitting by the fire after Boone and Levi had turned in, Eli looked around the cabin. The curtains Clara had sewn from flour sacking, the cushions she had stitched for the chairs, the braided rug on the floor made from strips of old blankets, the jar of dried wildflowers on the windowsill. "Built this with our own hands," he said. "Every bit of it." Clara leaned into his shoulder. "Every bit of it." "Gone in February," she told him. They were sitting at the breakfast table. Morning light slanted through the window and turned the coffee steam to gold. Clara set down her fork and said, "Eli, I need to tell you something." He looked up, instantly alert, the way he always was when he heard that particular tone in her voice. "You are going to be a father." The chair fell over backward. Eli was around the table and lifting her before the sound of it hitting the floor had finished echoing. He spun her once, set her down with absurd gentleness, and then the joy on his face was replaced by something older and darker. Fear. "My mother died giving birth to Levi," he said. His voice had gone very quiet. "I was 8 years old. I watched my father break apart afterward. He was never the same man." Clara took his face in both her hands. "I am not going anywhere, Eli. Winter always ends. We face this together, you and me." "You and me," he repeated, as if memorizing the words. Their son was born at the end of August on a day so hot the horses stood in the creek up to their bellies. Opal Jensen, who had delivered half the babies in the territory, talked Eli through the labor with the patient firmness of a woman who had seen everything and was not impressed by any of it. When she placed the baby on Clara's chest, a squalling, red-faced infant with a shock of dark hair and gray eyes that would later settle into the exact same shade as his father's, Eli made a sound Clara had never heard from him. Something between a laugh and an awe wrenched from deep in his chest. "He is perfect," Eli whispered. "Clara, he is perfect." They named him Jacob Nolan Dawson, and from the moment Eli held his son for the first time, those enormous, scarred hands cradling the tiny body with a gentleness so profound, it seemed impossible for a man of his size. Clara knew that whatever wounds the war had carved into Elijah Dawson's soul had finally begun to heal. The years unfolded the way years do, one season at a time, each one layering upon the last like rings in a tree. Sarah Rose came the following June, fierce from her first breath, her first word not mama or papa, but horse, shouted at a startled coyote through the kitchen window. Boone declared her his favorite relative. Daniel James arrived 3 weeks early on a stormy October night, when the road to town was a river of mud and no doctor could get through. Eli delivered his third child with his own hands, following Clara's instructions, his voice steady, even though his face was white as winter, and his hands were shaking so badly he had to clench them into fists between contractions to make them stop. When the baby finally came small and red and furious, and Eli placed him on Clara's chest, the sound that came out of him was not a word. It was something older than language. Relief and terror and love and gratitude, all compressed into a single ragged breath. "That was the most terrifying thing I have ever done," he told Clara Mom later, sitting on the porch in the rain with a cup of coffee going cold in his hands. "And I have been to war." "You were perfect," she said, leaning against him, calm and steady, just like always. "I was not calm. I was holding my breath for 3 hours straight." She laughed. He almost smiled. And the rain kept falling on the mountains they had made their own. Boone found his own path. It was the hardest conversation between the two oldest brothers, harder even than the revelation about the mail order advertisement, because this time Boone was asking for something Eli did not want to give: permission to leave. "I want to build something of my own, Eli. A horse operation, 10 miles east near the river. Good grazing, good water." Eli was silent for a long time. Clara stood in the kitchen doorway, one hand resting lightly on his shoulder, not speaking, just present. A reminder that letting go of someone you love is not the same as losing them. "You are good with horses, Boone," Eli said at last. "Best I have ever seen. Go build something." Boone embraced his brother, the first time in years, two big men holding on to each other in the kitchen, and Clara turned away to let them have the moment, because some things are too private to watch even for the people who love you most. "Nobody touches my family," Boone said, his voice rough, "even if my family is 10 miles east." He came back every Sunday for dinner, without fail, for the rest of his life. Levi became the first school teacher in Copper Creek. He opened his classroom in the back of the church and taught 15 children to read and write and do sums, including Peter Garrett, who had stood silent and bloody beside his dead father on a September road and was now 4 years later the brightest student in the territory. Levi married a woman named Catherine Hale, the daughter of a bookseller from Helena, who loved words as much as he did. On the night before his wedding, Eli found Levi on the porch and said something he had never said before. "Mama would have been proud of you. What you did, the advertisement bringing Clara here, it was the bravest thing anyone in this family has done." Levi looked at his oldest brother with wide green eyes. "You mean that?" "I keep my word." And with those 4 words, a quarter century of guilt that Levi had carried since the day he was born, the guilt of having cost his family their mother simply by existing, was lifted from his shoulders and set down at last. Clara did one more thing that year, something she had been thinking about since the night she found the box of unsent letters under Eli's bed. She wrote to Alice Mercer. She wrote her own letter first, a careful, honest letter explaining who she was and how she had come to be Eli's wife. Then she gathered every one of Eli's letters, all of them 10 years of monthly dispatches written to a woman who did not know they existed, and she mailed them all in a single package to an address in Davenport, Iowa. 6 weeks later, a reply came. Alice Mercer, now Alice Mercer, Thompson had remarried a good farmer who treated her well. Daniel Jr. was 15, strong and healthy, and wanted to be a doctor. She had read every one of Eli's letters, all 120 of them, and she had wept, and then she had laughed, and then she had written back to say the thing Eli had needed to hear for a decade. She had forgiven him long ago. There was nothing to forgive. Daniel had loved Eli like a brother, and knowing that Eli had carried Daniel's memory all these years, had written to her faithfully, even though he could not bring himself to send the words, was the most beautiful thing she had ever learned about a man she had thought she already knew everything about. Eli read the letter on the porch. He sat in the rocking chair Clara had asked him to build, the one with roses carved into the back, because she had mentioned once that her mother had loved roses, and he read the letter twice. Then he folded it, put it in his shirt pocket, and sat there for 20 minutes, looking at the mountains, saying nothing. That night, in the darkness of their bedroom, he pulled Clara close and whispered into her hair, "Thank you for making me brave enough to stop hiding." She kissed his jaw, rough with stubble, tasting of salt and coffee and home. "You were always brave, Eli. You just needed someone to remind you." 20 years passed, then 25, then 30. Clara's hair turned from honey blonde to silver. Eli's temples went from gray-streaked to white. He moved slower now, the years of labor and old war wounds settling into his joints like winter settling into the mountains. But he was still the first one awake every morning, still lit. The fire still swept the porch, still filled the water bucket. Jacob grew tall and broad as his father married a girl named Emma from a neighboring ranch and had 3 children of his own. Sarah rode horses better than any man in the territory, married a horse trader named Michael, whom Boone had introduced, and refused to be anything less than exactly who she was. Daniel became a teacher like his uncle Levi, and married quietly and happily. On their 10th anniversary, Eli took Clara to Denver. 3 days in a city, the farthest she had traveled since the stagecoach that had brought her to Montana. They stayed in a hotel with real sheets and ate in restaurants with tablecloths and saw a play at a theater with velvet seats. On the last night lying in the unfamiliar darkness, Eli turned to her and asked the question he had been carrying for a decade. Do you ever regret it staying? Clara propped herself on her elbow and looked down at him, silver-haired, weathered, lines carved around his eyes by 30 years of squinting into the sun and smiling more than he ever thought he would. Still the most handsome man she had ever seen. Still the mountain she had built her life around. Not for a single moment. Not when it is hard. Not when the winters are brutal. Not when I am hauling water or chasing goats or washing the same porch for the 10,000th time. This is my life, Eli. You and the children, and the cabin, and the mountains, and all of it. This is where I belong. You are sure. I have never been more sure of anything. He pulled her close. You are home now, he whispered. I have been home since the day you handed me your canteen and did not say a word. When Clara was 50, the pains began. Not hers, his. Eli started having trouble on the stairs. Shortness of breath after tasks that used to be effortless. A grayness in his skin that no amount of sun could burn away. Dr. Nate Warden, who had been caring for the Dawson family for 20 years, gave the diagnosis with the blunt honesty that frontier people expected and deserved. His heart was failing. The hard living, the war wounds, the years. 5 years maybe if he was careful. Clara refused to accept it the way she refused to accept anything she had not agreed to. She researched remedies. She adjusted his diet. She made him rest. She watched over him with the ferocity of a woman who had already lost too much and would not lose this. But she could see him slowing. The man who once split 50 logs without stopping now rested after 10. The man who rode the entire property in a single day now needed breaks every hour. The mountain was wearing down. I am not ready, she told him one night, her head on his chest, listening to the heartbeat that had become the metronome of her life. I do not know how to do this without you. You are the strongest person I know, Eli said. You survived bandits, you climbed a chimney, you raised 3 children and taught a mountain man how to dance. You can survive anything. I do not want to survive without you. He held her tighter. And you are my heart. You have been since the day you refused to break. Eli Dawson lived not 5 years but 7. Stubborn to the last. He lived to see Sarah marry. He lived to hold his first grandchild. He lived to watch Daniel open the first real schoolhouse in Copper Creek, built with lumber that Boone hauled from the mountains for free. He lived for 7 more years of sunsets on the porch and coffee in the morning, and the sound of Clara's voice reading aloud by firelight. On a cool October morning when the aspens had turned gold and the air tasted of coming snow, Elijah Dawson took his last breath. Clara was holding his hand. His children were gathered around the bed. The cabin smelled of wood smoke and pine and coffee because Clara had brewed a pot, even though no one was going to drink it, because the smell of coffee was the smell of their life together, and she wanted him to take it with him wherever he was going. I love you, Clara whispered. Love you, he breathed back. Always. A long pause. The fire popped. The creek sang outside. I keep my word. The last time. The heaviest time. And then the room was quiet, and the biggest, strongest, most stubborn man Clara Whitfield Dawson had ever known was finally irrevocably still. The grief was an ocean. Clara drowned in it for weeks, moving through her days like a woman underwater, breathing only because her body insisted on it. Her children held her. Boone came every day and sat on the porch without speaking, his amber eyes wet and his jaw locked because Boone Dawson had never learned any way to grieve, except in silence and fury. And fury had no target here. Levi read to her in the evenings, his gentle voice filling the cabin with stories that distracted her from the enormous absence sitting in every chair and filling every corner. Slowly, Clara learned to carry the weight. She did not get over it. You do not get over losing the love of your life. You simply learn to walk with the weight the way a pack horse learns to walk with a heavy load, one step and then another and then another. She found comfort in the life they had built, in the children, the grandchildren, the cabin that still smelled like him, the porch he had swept every morning, the creek that sang the same song it had been singing since before they were born and would go on singing long after they were gone. Clara lived for 15 more years. She did not remarry, though several of the widowers in the valley made their interest known. She declined each one politely and without hesitation. She had had the love of her life. She did not need another. She sat on the porch every evening in the rocking chair Eli had made for her, the one with roses carved into the back. She watched the sunsets paint the mountains in fire and gold, and sometimes, when the light was right and the wind was still, she could almost hear his voice, deep and rough like gravel settling at the bottom of a mountain creek. Coffee is ready. When Clara was 71 years old, she woke one morning in late October and felt different. Lighter, as if gravity had loosened its grip on her just a little, just enough to notice. She rose and dressed and went through her day with unusual care, speaking to each of her children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, touching their faces, saying things she wanted them to remember. That evening, she climbed the porch steps for the last time and sat in her rocking chair. The sun was setting behind the Bitterroot Range, and the sky was the color of every beautiful thing she had ever known. Orange, rose, gold, purple deepening into the blue-black of coming night. She closed her eyes and let the memories come. The stagecoach burning, 3 riders on the horizon, a man dismounting in a single fluid motion, 6 feet 5 inches of rough edges and raw strength. Steel gray eyes meeting hers across a field of wreckage and smoke. A canteen handed to her without a word. A porch swept before dawn, a hand covering hers on the handle of an axe. A voice in the dark telling her about a friend who died too young. A leather cord tied around her finger, with the precision of a jeweler. A baby placed on her chest, while the biggest man in the territory wept. A life, built from nothing, with their own hands. "I am ready now," she whispered to the evening air. "I am ready to see you again." Sarah found her the next morning still in the rocking chair, the autumn sun warm on her face. She was gone, but she did not look gone. She looked like a woman who had finally arrived where she had been traveling toward her whole life. Peaceful, complete, home. They buried her beside Eli on the hill overlooking the valley under the aspen trees that turned gold every October. The whole community came. 3 generations of Dawsons and the countless lives that Clara and Eli had touched, healed, fed, sheltered, and loved over nearly half a century. Jacob stood before the gathered crowd. He was a big man now, silver-haired, with his father's throne and his mother's green eyes, and when he spoke, his voice carried across the valley the way his father's once had. "They showed us what love looks like," he said. "Real love. The kind that gives without expecting anything in return. The kind that keeps its word. The kind that sweeps the porch before dawn and fills the water bucket and ties a leather cord around a finger and calls it a ring." He paused, swallowed, continued. "Bandits took everything she had. 3 brothers gave her everything they had, and they called it even. But the truth is we are all richer for having known them. Every single one of us standing here today existed because a woman from Boston answered an advertisement and a man from Montana answered a prayer he did not know he had prayed." That evening, as the family gathered at the cabin for a meal, someone noticed something remarkable. 2 aspen trees at the edge of the property trees Eli had planted the year he married Clara, one for him and one for her, had grown together over the decades. Their roots had tangled beneath the earth. Their trunks leaned toward each other. Their branches intertwined, gold leaves trembling together in the wind, 2 separate trees that had become one. "Just like Mama and Papa," Sarah said quietly, and every person in the yard nodded because it was true. 2 lives that had started apart, battered and stripped and left with nothing, had found each other in the wilderness and grown together until no force on earth could separate them. And every October, when the aspens turned gold and the air tasted of snow and the mountains stood eternal against a sky so blue, it hurt to look at the Dawson family gathered on that hill and told the story. It always began the same way. Once, a long time ago, a girl from Boston lost everything she had on a burning stagecoach in Montana, and 3 brothers gave her everything they had and called it even. It always ended the same way. What they gave each other was worth more than everything in the world combined. They gave each other love, family, purpose, a lifetime of kept promises and sweat porches and coffee in the morning. And that, in the end, was the greatest gift of all. The mountains stood eternal as they always had and always would. The seasons turned. The creek sang its endless song over smooth stones, and the love story of Clara Whitfield and Elijah Dawson endured, passed from generation to generation, carried on the same wind that stirred the golden aspens on the hill where they lay together. A reminder that sometimes the worst day of your life leads to the best. That sometimes losing everything is how you find what truly matters. That sometimes in the wild and rugged places of the world, love grows where nothing else will, and it changes everything. And that winter, no matter how long, no matter how cold, no matter how dark, always ends. Love does not.